Okay.
Well, I don't know how many folks we're going to have here, but I'm just going to start shooting the breeze with all of you. We'll just see what happens. If some more folks come, great. I'm traveling with my wonderful traveling companion, Camelot. She's a golden doodle. And as I was getting a little bit older, I began to have allergies. And so somebody said, well, you ought to try these poodle mixes. When I was a kid one time, we inherited a real poodle, and I mean one of them was cut like a poodle too. And I grew up in Harlowton, a small town. You can imagine a real poodle in a town, and everybody rolled their eyes. What did my parents think they were up to at the time? But they kind of inherited from some people that were moving to Europe. And so my parents had 2 weekly newspapers in Harlowton and Reigate. Today it combined into one. I came from central Montana. Actually grew up there. All my brothers and sisters as well. My folks had the paper, and those two papers now combined, but they had them for over 33 years. I was born in Havre. My dad was a native of Anaconda, my mother a native of Whitehall. And so I married a girl from Glendive. So I've kind of covered a lot of the bases, I'll tell you. And I know quite a bit about Montana, and that's, I have to admit, it's kind of my love affair. So I like wearing my Montana shirt here that I have on today, and I brought one along that I normally be wearing, except for the circumstances that I'll tell you about. That's what we're going to do today too, and that is never stop exploring. And you know, as long as we do that, life is pretty darn enriching. And why am I here? Basically because Wendy got in touch with me, and she went through the humanities, and humanities.
I got the best one.
Humanities Montana is one of those wonderful programs that we have in Montana, but all across the United States. And the intent is really to bring the arts, literature, music to communities. And more often than not, I think it's the smaller communities that tend to appreciate and like these things. And I think that's terrific. Because very often, you know, you go to the big towns here in Montana, let's say you go to Billings or Bozeman or Missoula, it's easy for them to bring in these speakers from wherever, or somebody say, oh yes, I know somebody, and makes it a little bit easier. But in smaller communities sometimes, you kind of feel a little bit like you're kind of outside the mainstream. So that's one of the great things about the humanities program. And the humanities includes all kinds of different expression. So it could be dance, it could be music, it could be a lecture, it could be art, and it can be for young and old. So down the road, I'm going to be going over here to the Darby schools. I hope when I go, I'd really love it if I could have all the kids together. I really like it when I have K-12, to tell you the truth. So the humanities is, I think, one of the great expressions that we have nationally that we can get out to communities all across the country. So it's really it's a wonderful program. And it is headquartered in Montana. It's headquartered at the university in Missoula, and you can easily just look up Humanities Montana or Montana Humanities, and you'll drop a website that'll show you all kinds of different speakers and possibilities. You don't have the idea of having programs down the road. So it's really a fun thing to do. Now, normally I would be wearing my Never Stop Exploring shirt, but because my wife is right now the president of the University of Montana, so since the day she took over a year ago in November, coming out of retirement, something we never expected was going to happen, but I've worn something grizz ever since. I am going to until the day that Seth is going to be taking over as the president. I have actually said I am there for my wife, and that's all there is to it. And so one thing I'm going to have to kind of cover things up just a little bit, but not too much when I'm down in Bozeman on Saturday, because if there's one thing that brings us together, this is what it is. You know that. It doesn't matter whether you live in Ekalaka, you live in Eureka, you live in Broadus, or you live in Baker. Everybody is very familiar here. So you can go to every coffee shop, every school kid, ranchers getting together, people just stopping each other out on Main Street. Everybody seems to have, well, this is my team, this is who I'm for. So I don't have to worry about this in football, but when I go to Bozeman, which I do for the when the Grizzlies and the Cats play, both men and women, I have to sit between my two Bobcat brothers. And so makes life kind of a little difficult unless I'm winning. Then things are just a little bit easier. But you know, think of the things that bind us together as Montanans. And this one, in so many ways, is really almost the glue that is Montana. So it doesn't matter where we are, we all have kind of an understanding. So why did I get interested in all of this? This particular one, I talk about homesteading and cowboys and Indians and the Lewis and Clark expedition. But this one is one that really seems to be kind of popular right now. And I think it's because of a phenomena that is out there. And that is we're losing our small towns. Small towns are really finding it tough to be all over the country. It doesn't matter if you live in New York, you live in Florida, if you live in Texas, if you live in Colorado, you live in Idaho. The fact is we are becoming much more of an urbanized people. And what were the reasons that small towns came into existence in the beginning even? And that's one of the things we're going to talk about here a little bit. But I'm going to talk about how they came into being a bit, and then talk about where they are right now and where they might be going. But also, why is it that some small towns are doing very well? Because there are some examples, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here in Montana right away to show you. But one of the things I want to mention, and I'm delighted that somebody who we just got acquainted, and I just talked to his wife yesterday, and if that's not the case of what Montana is, I don't know what is, and that is we are definitely a state where we know each other. My wife was at a conference one time when she was the head of a college down in Wayne, Nebraska, Wayne State College. She was the first woman president down there. She was the first woman president of Montana when she was chancellor at Western and Dillon. Then she was the one and only woman to be in charge of all the university system when she was the commissioner here in Montana for 9 years. And of course now her role, first woman again in Missoula right now. But one of the things, she was at a national conference one time, and it had folks that were there from the University of Chicago who hosted this big event, from the University of Florida representing big Southern University, Princeton, private, very upstanding, big monies. So Sheila was representing small colleges, universities across America. And so it was hosted by the University of Chicago, and everybody, each one of them in their turn got up and said something about the advantages of going to their institution or what kind of kids they get to go there and everything. But when Sheila got up, and she in so many ways was speaking about whether it would have been the plains of Nebraska or it would have been the Dakotas or Wyoming or eastern Colorado, Wyoming or Montana or Idaho. And then she said, you know, out in this area of the world, we know each other. In this area of the world, there aren't as many of us. And so she said, I walk around on the campus and I know many of the students by name. They all know who I am. She says, I know who the librarians are. I know who does the cooking. I know who does the cleaning. I know who's out there worrying about maintenance or the lawns or whatever. She said, that's one of the great things about being in rural America and being on a small college campus. And that one had about 3,400 students. And she said, you know, when we drive down the road, we drive like this, and we wave at each other. We nod kind of like that, how you doing? Or we go like this, or we'll just go, how you doing? Like this. Or we'll just raise a hand up a little bit. She says, you know, sometimes we go like this. And she said, when we do that, we call it the friendly farmer finger flicker. And she said, now everybody be careful, I say that, but at any rate, she said, why do we do that? Well, somebody said one time we do it because we're lonely, and it might have a little truth to it. But the other thing is, the president of the University of Chicago jumped right into it and said, Sheila, you might be able to do that out in the American West, but you're not going to do it in downtown Chicago. So you think about it, that's the kind of thing that makes our area of the world magical, and that is we can know each other. We're not very far apart of having one or two or three people somewhere along the line where we can say, oh, I know him. Oh yeah, I know that person as well. I know somebody that knows that somebody. So the two of us just meeting a little bit ago, and yesterday I sat at a table with his bride, and his son-in-law who's going to become the president following my wife at U of M. It gives you kind of an idea that in some ways we're not that far apart from each other. It doesn't matter we live in Billings, or we live in Lewistown, or we live in Hobson or we live up in Glasgow. We are not that far away from each other. But the thing that binds us more than anything is when that game is played. And this Saturday will be down in Bozeman, every other year. Interestingly enough, it's the second longest rivalry west of the Mississippi River. Only UCLA and University of California have a longer rivalry than the university that we have here in Montana. That says something about us too, that we've been around a while and we care very deeply about some things. Now, what is it? Yes, ma'am.
I want to make sure your microphone works well.
Oh, it does? Oh, good. Well, then I'll stand right back here. Was everybody hearing me okay anyway?
That's correct.
Okay, but let's make it even a little bit better. All right, I think we'll just get going, and then I'll just bounce around with a lot of different things to show you. But, so here it is. This is the big topic here, and let's see where we go from here. We'll see which way does this thing work. Okay, so far, I don't see anything working here. So, Wendy?
Yes, sir.
We need you.
What happened?
I don't know.
What are you doing?
I haven't done a thing. I looked at it and it doesn't work. All right, let's see. Okay.
And let's just go,
Okay. Now, can we use this one too, or just over there?
I would just use
Okay,
this
we'll
one.
just use that one. Okay. So let's say, what do people think of Montana? Okay. I was with a friend down in Alabama, and we went into this restaurant, and this actually was the mat in the restaurant. And so my friend introduced me and said, well, my friend is from Montana, and this little waitress had that wonderful accent. She says, Montana, where's that? I said, well, it's up here, I guess, in what we call Davy Crockett territory. Oh, Davy Crockett, that means up north. Yes, yeah, you got it, that's where I'm from. I've never been anybody from up there. So she had no idea, frankly, where we were. Now, have you ever seen a New Yorker's view of things? And that is, here you have Brooklyn, here's New York. By the time you come out here, you can see the capital of North Dakota, South Dakota, and the capital of Oregon is Idaho, Washington. Here's San Francisco, California, and Hollywood. And if you go over here, Wyoming is the capital of Montana. So that's a New Yorker's idea of the world, and boy, they feel that way in a lot of ways. And let's take a look at the Bostonians' idea. Look at this. Here we are out Chesapeake Bay, Cape Cod, and I was just back at a meeting in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was shooting the breeze back there, and I had this particular piece along with me. I showed it to somebody back there, and they said, now, where are you all from? I said, Montana. And they said, where is that? And I said, well, it's out here in the western prairies. Oh, way out there. There aren't a lot of you out there, are there? Well, I thought, maybe I should just bring a map. Rather than this, maybe that would have it all wrong for them. Now, a lot of people have this idea about Montana, and I actually gave a talk not long ago back in the Midwest, and I said something about this, and I just made this all up and said, well, jackalope are still out in Montana and southeastern Montana and northeastern Wyoming. And that's the only places where you have them. The rest of them, they're not around anymore. And I had people that were there who were looking at each other like, is this guy really telling us what's going on or not? And of course, what happens to our fish in the wintertime? They don't freeze to death. They get these. If you go fishing early in the spring, maybe you get there, you're lucky enough, you can get yourself a fur fish. And, a lot of people love to come out because of Yellowstone. They love the Yellowstone. Everybody loves it. Most visited park in America. And, we share it with Idaho and Wyoming, and we treasure the place, or the same way with Glacier, the wonderment of Glacier. Everybody likes driving up to the big highway. We pay real close attention. How long will it be before they get the road open every year? And, Sperry and the Sperry Chalet got hit this summer. Boy, I'll tell you, there was a move afoot right away. We're going to get that baby restored, because that's one of our treasures, of course. And so when you take a look at Montana, you can see it in all kinds of different ways. But I see Montana in so many ways as really being three unique states. And that is, over here we have mountain Montana. And then in this area of Montana, it would be the mountains and the plains. So you would have the Judiths and the moccasins and the bear paws. Then when you get over in this area of Montana, you're really in plains Montana. And we're really pulled in all these different directions. If you live Great Falls North, a lot of people would pay close attention to the Canadian Football League because the great football player Dave Dickinson, who played for U of M and is now a coach. And one time he was the top player in the CFL. A lot of people identify with Canadian football. And when I fell in love with a young lady from Glendive, the first time I met her parents over here in Glendive, and her dad was reading that morning's Minneapolis Star-Tribune. He would come on the train every day, and he was asking me, did I think the Golden Gophers would have a good team this year, and what about the Vikings? Well, I was a quick study. I'll tell you, I learned about those in a hurry, but I didn't pay much attention to them before. And you know, if you're down here in the Billings area, you really identify a great deal with the how Denver's doing, which is not very good this year in football. But you kind of identify with the ball teams that are in that area of the world. And when Sheila was down here in the Dillon area, everybody was talking about the Utah Jazz. Everybody was familiar. And then, of course, over in western Montana, we often are wondering how in the heck are the Sea Chickens going to do this year, you know? So we're pulled in different directions simply because of this unbelievable size that we have that makes up Montana. So when you just think of our towns and how we're scattered all over the place, and a lot of us can identify with a lot of places and say, hey, I know where Eureka is, or Thompson Falls, or Anaconda, or Grass Range. I pay close attention to these things. And a lot of Montanans wouldn't be hesitant at all right now in saying that I know who's playing in the big ball games right now, because we are now at the very point where from the AA down to six-man football, we know. And in Montana, you do a lot of traveling. So here's Class B. You know, Eureka is going to be playing Shelby, and we have Columbia Falls coming down to play Hamilton, and we have in the Class B 8-man Drummond and Phillipsburg. Now they've joined each other to be the Titans, and they're going all the way over to play Forsyth, that just is going to 8-man football, going down from Class B to C. And Billings Senior against Helena High, and Bridger playing all the way over here to Westby Grenora. So, you know, we're pulled in all these different directions, but a lot of people would say flat out, I know what we're talking about. I know this. This is Montana. So you can kind of identify. Now, you can see that we have the big interstate highway system, which is showing right here and coming down this way. But Montana seems to be pockmarked with an awfully lot of roads, until you begin to look very closely, and you can see vast, vast open areas of Montana where there are not a lot of roads, where there are a lot of very, very, very small communities. And we can see Montana, but saying, okay, well, here's a better picture of it. Give us kind of the way and how we settle along Highway 2 or 12 or 15 or 94 and 90. Now let's just take a look at a typical Montana town. But this, in a way, isn't atypical. This is the little Westby, way up in the northeast corner. Westby at one time was the westernmost town of North Dakota. But when the Sioux Line built as a spur off the Great Northern, it actually built in Montana, not in North Dakota. And so the community literally moved over to Montana. So BY in Danish is town. So Westby would have been west town of North Dakota. Now here it is, Westby, the easternmost town in Montana, interestingly enough. But here's another thing that's kind of interesting here, and that is if you go and visit the school in Westby, if you go into the school itself, you're in Montana. If you go in the playground, you're in North Dakota. And they have joined with Renora in North Dakota, 15 miles away, and they've done very well for themselves. And they're playing a state championship game again. So wouldn't it be interesting that, say, their girls basketball team, one year could be the champs of Montana, and the next year be the champs of North Dakota? Because that's what they do. They go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with all their sports, drama, speech, debate, everything. So it's really kind of one of those interesting things about Montana. So there's a way in which a small town has been able to survive. And right there in the middle of town, you see the sign that says "Leaving Montana," and it's right in town. So you see all kinds of places like this. We go down in the southeastern corner, get down into the broadest country in Alzada, and you see how Montana very often, you'll see the little rodeo grounds that are out there, or the little baseball diamond, or you see one of those places that just brings everybody in, and that's what you see when you get down in the Alzada country, the Stoneville Saloon, cheap drinks. I always like that one down there. And that's right along our little border towns. And you see this in too many towns in Montana. This is very, very typical of a lot of places where we see where a town is just basically dried up and blown away. So for example, here I have a doctorate in history, and my dad, but the day that I walked in to see him, and I was kind of walking like this, like I was kind of a big guy, and he says, I know why you're walking like that. You have finally seen the four corners of Montana. I said, yep, I've been west of Grenor, and I've been to Alzada, and I've been to Yak, and I've been to Monida. But wait a minute, if you live in Darby, Darby might say that we really are one of the corners too, and maybe we have 5 corners in Montana. So if you're down in Monida, they'd say it, and if you're in Darby, you probably want to say it too. Don't blame it. Maybe Sula would want to take your place though. They might argue and say it's really us. But this is very typical of too many places of Montana, of communities that have just dried up and blown away. So we'll see schools like this that are just in numerous places, and you wonder that here were places, because of the old homesteading days, the cowboy era, that you really had places that were just doing very well for themselves. And as we travel, we've all have seen these places just like this one. They're everywhere. We see so many beautiful scenes though as we travel around, and then we see all these places that look like they're just kind of blown away. There's the famous Dirty Shame Saloon up in way up there in Yak. If you haven't been to Yak yet, you got to put Yak on your bucket list. You got to go see it sometime. So you can see how population changes over a period of time and population densities. And look at the number of places in Montana where the population is 1 to 10 people per mile. So when you take a look at that and look at how much green you have, that heavy green, and you'll see where you get down to the point where you really have over 5,000, you don't have very many communities, do you? You have Missoula, Billings, Bozeman, Great Falls, Kalispell, Helena, and that's it. That's it. 9 communities in Montana have 1/3 of the population. 9 communities. Nobody ever talks like that, but they do. 9 communities have 1/3 of the population of this state. So why did I get interested in this whole thing? When we lived in Nebraska, I was doing some work with speaking in a number of sites in the state, and I came across a piece of literature dealing with rural Nebraska, and I got fascinated. So I visited with some folks at the University of Nebraska who were doing studies on what was happening in rural Nebraska. And I really got quite intrigued because of the famous Ogallala, the water area that is out in western Nebraska, which, by the way, is shrinking way faster than anybody ever thought it would. And of course it ties in with the old Keystone Pipeline here in Montana coming down from Alberta, and there's a real fear, people that are the ranchers of western Nebraska, well, I'll tell you, could be in court forever before they're ever going to allow that thing to be built. But their rural problems and issues are very often far different than what you see in big communities. So let's have a little warm-up quiz. How'd you like this? Want to do a warm-up quiz? I'll ask you a couple of questions, see how smart you all are. Okay, maybe I will. Okay, what's toponymy? Anybody know that? Anybody know that word? It's kind of an interesting word. It's the study of place names. And I tell people this all the time, when you're traveling around Montana, be sure when you travel, let's see, where did I put my little briefcase down? Well, I have my little book in the briefcase. It's this thick, and I always carry one with me. So when I drive around, I'm always looking up the names of places. I'm just intrigued with that. So that's the study of place names. All right, here's one. 4 corners of Montana. Well, I gave it away to you now, so you've got these down. Yak, Alzada, Westby, Monida. And should we go ahead and add a 5th one and say it's Darby? Okay, let's do that. So we'll say we have 5 corners. How's that? Yeah, that's higher math. Okay. Our smallest incorporated town, they wanted to change the name to Joe. Anybody remember what that was? Ismay. Remember, it was going to be Joe, Montana. Remember? And we could only get Joe to come out to Ismay. There we go. By the way, they did end up selling enough t-shirts that they paid for a new community hall and a fire hall. So they got something out of it by selling all those t-shirts, but Joe never did get there. Montana's last county created in the license plate number. Anybody want to guess? This is kind of a surprise to you. You're going to be a little shocked at this one, maybe.
56.
Petroleum is the last one that was created, 55. Now you would think it should be 56, which is Lincoln County, which is Libby. Well, it was done in the 1930s, and we're never going to change it. It was a power that Silver Bow County, and Butte had in the legislature. So Butte will be number one forever, so just plan on it, okay? Because it ain't gonna happen that we're changing them. That's it. So, all right, now, 2 most popular high school mascot names. Anybody want to guess? Just think of something wild. I'll give it away. There, the Bulldogs and the Panthers. Okay, next one. A town designed around a central block with streets forming a radiant pattern from its corners. And I'm really grumpy because they don't tell this story. They should have a big sign out on the road. But this one's going to surprise you. It's the little town of Sims, just 35 miles outside of Great Falls. And I'll show you a picture of it a little bit later on. All right, our smallest state park. Well, for years and years, it was between Jordan and Miles City because it was one lone tree, but somebody cut the tree down. A lot of people do some of these nasty, mean things. Well, the smallest one we have today is Elkhorn, the old mining camp down in the area around Boulder. That's the smallest. Number of miles if you went from northwest to southeast. So let's go all the way up to the Dirty Shame, and let's go all the way down to El Zeta, just as an example. Just throw out numbers. Anybody want to say 300 miles? 400? 500? 600? Here's your answer. Look at this. 884 miles. Now guess what? If we would take all of New England, half of Pennsylvania, and half of New York, that's Montana. So when I was back in Providence at this big conference that I went to, one of my college roommates from my undergraduates from the University of Notre Dame, he proudly announced, he knew because I'd visited him a couple of times, but meeting some of my friends back there from other states, he said, I drove all the way across Rhode Island to have dinner with my friend. And I said, okay, Phil, now tell him how far you drove. He said, it took me 35 minutes. Well, Rhode Island just went over 1 million people, so the same population as us. And you literally can drive across the state in about 40 minutes. Now, just imagine, we can't get anywhere in 40 minutes. So, Broadus is the county seat of what county? This is really a tough one. I'll give that away to you. Look at that. Powder River. The famous Powder River letterbuck. Yep. But look at the license plate. 9. See, so some of them are so far off from what is really what they probably ought to be. The county seat of Webo. This is a toughie. I love this one. It's Webo. Webo, Webo. Okay. Now Robbers Roost. We all know that one? Anybody know where that is? Okay, Robbers Roost down by Alder, Virginia City. Okay, why is St. Marie famous and in the news? Anybody know? The last Air Force base ever created in the United States was created in St. Marie, just north of Glasgow, Montana. And there is Glasgow Air Force Base, completely closed down today. A few people have gone in and buy some of the property. It's kind of wild fringe element that came in for a time. It used to be that Boeing would fly in and they would use the runways when they were doing some of their testing of their big aircraft out of Seattle. But they don't use that right now. I don't know. It just sits there when you drive out there. It just kind of gives you the willies. The town made famous because of its pig races. And if you haven't been to Bear Creek, you haven't lived. Bear Creek is about 12 miles away from Red Lodge, the site of the largest single mine disaster we've ever had in Montana. And that kind of brought everything to a screeching halt. And yes, people do sit there and bet on the pigs. The race around this little racetrack, and you roll your eyes, and every time I've been there, people are just captivated with it. It's put Little Bear Creek on the map. They found something. All right. The Free Enterprise Radon Mine down in Boulder. Yeah, a lot of people go to that one. Okay, there's your test. Now some Montana facts. Here we are, just 1 million people, but look at this population. 1/3 from Billings down to Kalispell. So Kalispell at 22,000 is number 9. And then 14 more communities add up to 92,000 plus from Havre down to Dillon. So when you take a look at populations in Montana, you can see we don't have an awfully lot of people. Now here's some more facts. Look at this. 7 towns over 10,000, 10 over 5, 4 more over 4, 4 more over 3, 6 more over 2, 12 more over 1,500, 134 incorporated. And look at this. This always blows everybody's mind. We have 175 unincorporated communities, meaning they don't have a mayor, don't have a city council. How do they take care of their water issues? How do they take care of any kind of garbage pickup? You know, how do they do these things? It's kind of amazing, but that's the reality of a lot of towns in Montana. So it kind of surprises people that we would have these kind of facts. Now, what's a town? Reading, what is a town? Well, the U.S. Census, they always come up with something really interesting. Larger than a village and smaller than a city. That's a town. I love that definition. Well, yeah, to skip day, everyone goes. The whole school goes to the graduation party afterwards in the same party. House newer than 1980 is owned by rich people. Yeah. Skip a class and the whole town knows before your mom goes sniping. You like to drive the 3-block drag. Does this ring any bells with anybody? Small towns, yeah? You know, everyone in all 4 classes can't help but date a friend of an ex-girlfriend. Never lock the doors. 3-hour trip to the store, you got to stop to talk with everyone. True? Yes. Never give a direction by street names. Now, I made up some of these, but I think there's a lot of truth to them, to tell you the truth. Here's some more small town facts, and this is a reality. Small town, aging population. That's a characteristic of small towns. Little political clout, lack of diversity, and an older infrastructure. So more older buildings in town, often not very well kept up. The lack of diversity, meaning that they tend to be people that say, we're German by background, French by background. They all came in as miners. They all came in to work in the lumber mills. In other words, they shared kind of a common denominator of some sort. Little political clout. Well, let me just give you an example of this, because this one always surprises. I just brought you the last couple of days of the Missoulian to show you something that's just for real, and that is, here was the headline just Tuesday, the 7th, the governor of Montana calling a special session. Okay? Here we go. Now, let's pick up today's paper, and it says, special session opens in Helena. Okay, now what's going to happen? Well, we don't know for sure, because we have an awfully lot of needs out there, and because of the fires particularly, we have some real problems. And we have some real problems. But guess what? Who's got the political clout? No, not you at all. That's the right answer. That's the right answer. Most of Montana, you're lucky if you have a senator that does not meet the criteria of what I have for the area of Montana I came from in Harleton, central Montana. North to south, the senatorial district is 100 miles. You very likely don't even know who your senator is. Now let's go to Billings. Billings has 11 senators of the 50 in the Montana legislature. So who has the political clout? If your water issues are real here, we'll say it's going to be tough. But if you have water issues in Billings, the needs are probably going to get taken care of. In other words, political clout is a very, very real. Nobody ever talks about it, though. We don't talk about it. We just say the Republicans this, the Democrats that. But if you live in rural areas, you've got some real, honest-to-goodness kinds of issues that are out there. Now, why do small towns struggle? Well, there's a great consolidation of the ag industry, for example. When I used to work on my grandfather's ranch, there were 8 guys that worked on this ranch. It was a big, wonderful cattle ranch. Do you know how many people work there today? 3. 3, that's all you need, because everything is mechanized. You can pick all the hay up very easily. You can get from one place to another much faster. You don't have to have somebody that is taking care of the machinery all the time. You can take it into town and get it fixed and nothing flat. Well, the loss of mining, oil, and timber. And you know this happened. You've seen it happen right down here in this beautiful valley where you live. The timber industry is nowhere as what it used to be. And I think of a great, great tragedy. Often mascot names give us a clue of a place. Libby, the loggers. What did Libby just lose? Their last mill. How is it going to recover? I have a real question mark with Libby. I don't know how they're going to make it this time. And Libby is a nice town. And it was a thriving lumber town forever and ever and ever and ever. And they just lost their last mill. Can they make it? How they pull themselves up? That's just for real. So the loss of mining, well, we know that. And anytime you propose a new mine, it's going to be a battle royal. And the classic illustration right now is White Sulphur Springs. White Sulphur Springs within 15 miles of the fabulous Smith River. Now, if there are things you put on your bucket list, here are a couple of them. One, you have to do the White Cliffs of the Missouri sometime. You have to do the Alberton Gorge, and you ought to do the Bitterroot River and just fish, a lazy fishing trip. And you ought to go down and do the Beaver Head, and you ought to go up and do the North Fork of the Flathead. You ought to do the White Cliffs of the Missouri, and you better do the Smith. And you're going to be one, if you're darn lucky. I've been able to do it 3 times, but I got kind of lucky with each instance. The Smith River, 50 plus miles, you know where you're going to camp, and you don't see anybody else, and you think, my goodness, this is unbelievable. Well, an outfit called Tintina, who's dying to put in a copper mine that is along the headwaters of one of the major streams coming into the Smith. And some people are going to go to war no matter what, for how long. And yet, what is White Sulphur Springs then? They've spruced up their downtown. They put in new street lights. They've worked on their school. They're banking on the fact that that mine is going to happen. Will it happen? And the famous Red Ants Pants is there. And they have a great little brew pub there now. So, but I have no idea whether it's going to happen. You know, it's a kind of an interesting one. And why do small towns? Well, location, location, location. If you live up in Circle or you live up in Jordan, you're a long ways away from anybody, I promise you. A long ways. So how do you get people to come along? Well, distance from anywhere. And you know, Montana is like this. We'll just pick good old Lewistown. Well, Lewistown, we say, is pretty close to the center of the state. It's actually a Hutterite colony about 9 miles west of Lewistown. They used to like to say it was the Yogo Inn or the kitchen sink of a home on the way up the hill in Lewistown, but it's actually just out of town a little bit. But Lewistown to Great Falls is 100, down to Billings is 120, to Bozeman 160, and if you want to go from Lewistown to Missoula, it's forever. That's Montana. So those are some interesting things about small towns too. Now let's take a look at K-12. If you just take a look at the number of school districts and the number of students that we have in each one of them, and if you take a look at this, we only have 14 schools that have over 1,000 students. And we have 54 high schools that have under 50 students. This year, I was at Judith Gap just before school started. This year they have 1 student in the high school. Judith Gap, Moore, and Hobson call themselves the Tri-Cities. And they had a darn good football team this fall, by the way. They're the real Tri-Cities, not that thing that's out there somewhere on the way out to Portland or somewhere. Not that one. But look at these numbers. Look at these numbers. And look what's over here. Is there a possibility that we're going to go to Class D? In some small towns, in order for you to play 6-man or 8-man football, do you know who gets to practice during the week? Can't play in the game, but practices? 7th and 8th graders. So that you can be running an offensive play, for example, your kicking game, whatever, but so that you have defensive backs or linemen, you can line up the 7th and 8th graders. So we're allowing that now. Nobody talks about it, but it's just a fact. Because you want your little community to make it. You want your kids to be involved in all kinds of activities, and that things will work out. So these numbers really give us kind of a clue about our towns. Now let's take a look at one-room schools. Now, this one's going to kind of surprise you a little bit. The famous one-room schools, number 1 in the United States is Montana. This year we have 69 one-room schools. We have more than Alaska. We have more than anybody else one-room schools. And, you know, my dad went to a one-room school. He was raised between Anaconda and Deer Lodge. And he lived in a little place called Racetrack, not too far from Galen and Warm Springs. And he used to brag about this, saying, you know, I'm a pretty smart student. Really, Dad? Yep. In fact, I was real smart. Graduated number 2 in my class. Really? He said that girl was so smart. She was so smart. Okay. All right, now let's take a look at some of those empty schools that we have out there. Look at these. Here's 4 towns you might recognize. You might not know any of the names. Oman, Shamat, Sumatra, Buffalo. Look at those. Now, when my folks were in the newspaper business, this was my mom and dad's letterhead when they would send out mail. Do you remember the old days when we used to write letters, that kind of world? You know that? You're familiar with that? Remember that world? Mhm. Yeah. Well, oh, I went too far, too fast, darn it. I would have found anything up. Nope, I guess I'm going to have to go that way. At any rate, on the back of my dad's letterhead, it had Harlowton right in the middle, and everything in the entire world, the focus was still Harlowton. That was the middle of the universe. Well, a town that tells its own story, and this was a book that was done by one of my closest pals in high school. It was a beautiful town that I lived in. This beautiful old hotel, built by craftsmen, Croatian Serbs. They did this a lot in central Montana. That was abandoned for 30 years, just recently repurchased. This is the main street of my hometown of Harlowton. We just had an all-school reunion this year. It was wonderful going back. Very vibrant grain area of the country for a long, long time. That building right there with the green on it, that's where we all used to go and drink Green Rivers and Coca-Colas for a nickel. And that was called Coach's Corner. Now it's an abandoned building, like so many. The courthouse, which was one time the school. If we didn't hear the famous Bear family, who have left a great deal of money, they're at one time the largest sheep people in the country. They're a beautiful place that's up near Martinsdale. But there would be no hospital in places like Roundup, Harlowton, Big Timber, White Sulphur Springs, if it hadn't been money left by the Bear family. And you know, you could be a long ways away from hospitals in a lot of places. It's the school that I went to in the old days. 11-man football when I was there. There was a real question mark this year whether or not Harlowton was even going to be able to play 8-man football. But at the last moment, Reigate joined up. It was a huge flap because Reigate is positive. They're just going to get swallowed by the behemoths of Harlowton. And that means the end of their school, and the kids will be getting bussed in. And that's just one of those kinds of issues that's out there. And I'll give you an idea right here. Here it is. A couple weeks ago, the big news of central Montana. Look at this. Committee discusses co-op possibilities. Harlowton approved the co-op. The kids will be going from Reigate to Harlowton 30 miles one way for practice every day. But the agreement is that they're going to play basketball in both communities, but only football in Harlowton, and they're going to have to be called Harlowton Engineers. For Reigate didn't have a lot of clout, they had to go along with it. That's the typical kind of problem with a lot of small places. And yet we know that a lot of people would say in small towns, I don't want to live anywhere else in the world. Now, one of the ways we saw the world impact was when it was with the building of railroads. Now, take a look at 1887, then 98, and then 1910. Now, this is the beginning of railroading just in Montana now. So look at that very carefully, and I'm going to show you kind of a change here. Now, take a look at it by the time we get around to 1915. Here is the Northern Pacific. Here's the Milwaukee. And these are the branch lines of the Milwaukee, and here's the Great Northern. Now, if you take a look at every one of those, guess what? A lot of those places never existed. They would use map pens sitting back in Chicago or Minneapolis, and they wanted people to think that there were towns out here so that it would encourage people to move out. And sometimes it was a stockyard, and sometimes it was a place where you picked up water or wood, or later on coal. So, a little bit misleading. So railroads had a tremendous impact on the changes of Montana. So here's the Burlington today, and this gives you an idea of the way the big behemoths are now. I know a lot about this one because my son, who's an attorney in Missoula, does a lot of work for the Burlington Northern. And this is typical of what we have. Now we go to places like Japan or China or all over Europe, and we see the amazing train service, and you know how we are out here. Is Amtrak running, not running? How are things going? They have to wait for every freight train to come through. And you know, our love affair with the automobile, so very real. So the big kids, this is the way we are, east-west, just like it was in an earlier day. And this gives you an idea, again, of some of the trackage that's out there in this day and age that we live in. Now let's go back and just look at historically the Northern Pacific Railway in the old days. and how it impacted in so many places. Or Jim Hill's Great Northern Railway. Or the Milwaukee, that starting in my hometown is where the electric started, going all the way to Avery, Idaho, 625 miles. All of these were fabulous railroads. They were great railroads. Going back to Notre Dame, or when I was in the Army, I rode the train every time I left from one of my military assignments, or when I was going back and forth to college. By the time the next generation of my own kids, neither one of them, who both went to Notre Dame as undergraduates, ever rode a train once. They flew in airplanes. I flew an airplane twice. Once when I was in college, and another time getting a chance to fly home from active duty on Christmas Eve. Those are the only two times I rode all the way up until my mid-20s in an airplane. Other than some military assignment, but not to just be going to have fun. So we see a lot of these abandoned spots out there from the old Milwaukee days. These were the substations where you got the electric power that you needed. So these railroads were terrific, and they advertised very well. Here's the old railway depot in my hometown of Harleton. They've done a good job of telling their railway story. Three Forks is starting to work on theirs, and Deer Lodge has got quite a ways to go. We got some beautiful old depots. Some of them are fabulous to go and see. The great depot up in Great Falls, or the one in Missoula, the old Milwaukee depot in Missoula. What a treasure. Then you go to Miles City, and it is just boarded up, and you keep thinking, why don't they do something, tell their story? That's what communities need to do. Every community needs to tell their own story. Well, I like to spend my time in the past lane. I like it back there, so that could be me. And history is kind of an ongoing puzzle. So what do we visit? People come out here for all kinds of reasons. So the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or they follow the Nez Perce Trail, so that's why they're kind of curious about this area. Or the early mining camps, or the caverns, or state parks, or museums, or homestead ranches, or the big towns, or the little towns, or the Lewis and Clark story. Those are the things that people like. They're all interested in Custer and Sitting Bull and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, seeing those monuments down there, and the wonderful story about the Nez Perce coming right through this very area on the famous 1,700-mile trek. And Chief Joseph, one of the greatest orators that we've all ever had in all of American history. And a lot of times we like to visit the old mining camps. Garnet, which is a beauty. But they don't do a very good job, even in Missoula, of telling you how to get the Garnet, and Garnet is a gem. A lot of people go down to Bannock or Virginia City, and they do pretty well in the summertime. I get invited down there to speak every year, and I love going down there. And of course, Bannock is where we started with our territorial government right there. And, when you go to a place that really haven't done a very good job of telling the story of Zordman Landusky, and boy, that's another area that's got some fabulous stories. And we do a fair job of telling of some of the activities down around Anaconda and Butte, and of course Butte mining, and their archives are terrific, but they don't do as good a job of telling their mining story. They need a museum of mining that just isn't up at the college to show some of those beautiful gemstones that they've got. They need a little more than that. They need to do a better job of telling the story about going from underground mining to going to the big open pit. And of course, if you go see the pit now, you pay $2.50 to go stand out on a boardwalk to see the largest Superfund site in the United States. Still, when the birds try to land there, they just, if they even make it. And then the palladium mine down at Nye, so we know mining is still a big deal. A lot of jobs down there, up and down, only palladium area in the whole country. And when you take a look at other kinds of mining activity, the kinds of stone that we have for oil production, for example. Or we go to the Bakken. Remember when the Bakken was in its heyday? And if you haven't been on a trip all the way up to Sydney Williston, it's well worth it to go take a look. And I'll tell you, the heyday of all of that, I don't think is ever going to come back quite the way it was. They actually built a motel in Sydney, Montana between April and October, and it is about 9 stories, and it was well built. You could go there anytime, and there'd be rooms galore right now when you go to the Bakken. And of course, we had the man camps that were set up. A lot of people, local ranchers, that made investments to build their own man camps. You go down over here to Whitehall. the Golden Sunlight Mine. Depending on what happens with gold, prices go up, prices go down. Right now, down again in the Golden Sunlight. That's down, so property in Whitehall, you can buy a pretty good piece of property at a pretty good price right now. Now look at Colstrip. And Colstrip is the one that we are all very familiar with. President Trump says coal's coming back, coal's coming back. But guess what? Coal ain't coming back, sorry. It ain't coming back. Right now, China, for example. China is moving into solar so fast, so fast. It's just hard to believe what they're doing. And you know what else they're doing? Wind energy. And they're doing it everywhere. And they're finding out that wind and solar are much cheaper to produce than anybody ever expected when we first got started. So what do you do? Colstrip is a beautifully designed little community. It's one of my favorite towns to go and visit. Really a nice little town. But you know, the cleanup that I was there from the very early days, when it was Western Energy and the Northern Plains Resource Council, cowboys, they'd come in and have the big debates and everything. And the town down there, you see the rail cars just sitting there now, just sitting. Miles and miles of those empty cars. Because we know what has happened out in Oregon and Washington. They're saying, nope, you're not going to build any ways in which you're going to offload coal cars onto big ships to go to the Orient. It's not going to happen. So right now, they're diverted to go all the way up into the area around Vancouver and Victoria to even ship out. So these are interesting. So here's Tintina. There's the beautiful Smith River. So wonderful. Now when you go visit White Sulphur Springs, for example, they've got a great story. This little place right here that was built by a guy who was a sheepman. The only way he could get his girlfriend to come out, he was Scottish. I have to have a castle. He says, I'll build you a castle. And that's their little museum now. And one time the Ringling Brothers Circus, they had this big dream that they were going to winter their kangaroos and hyenas and elephants and tigers and lions in White Sulphur Springs. That didn't go over too well, only happened 1 year. But there's a little town 12 miles away, Ringling, Montana. And here is downtown Ringling, or White Sulphur Springs, and it looks pretty vibrant right now, looking pretty darn good. But they're gambling on that Tintina to come in. So you drive around in many of these communities, they have wonderful little stories to tell. At White Sulphur Springs, and here, anybody recognize one of these? Oh, you do? I think you've seen those before. And here's the hot springs, White Sulphur Springs on an early day. That's where the name came from. It was a popular stop for Native Americans in the early days. It was a big ranching headquarters at one time. And of course, Red Ant's Pants is right there at White Sulphur Springs, and it has done great. And, you know, they get dynamic, big crowds with their big show that they've had every summer over the last few years. Now, let's go visit another place and see one that has done absolutely zero, and that's Fort Shaw. Fort Shaw, just 25 miles out of Great Falls. But Fort Shaw has two things making it very unique. It was the site of one of the early military forts. But number two, girls who won the famous 1904 World Championship, playing basketball at the World's Fair in St. Louis, were from the Fort Shaw Indian School, a boarding school for girls. There's no signs even there that tell the story. So what happened to Fort Shaw? It looks like blah. And what happened to the old fort? It's just fallen apart, and not one thing is said about the story of the 1904 girls team. So here were the troops that were there. This is what the remains look like. Now, shoot many shoot. This is their story. That's a gem of a story. And here are the girls. This was the team. Boy, oh boy, every kid in Montana ought to know this story, and everybody ought to get to Fort Shaw sometime. Now let's go up to a Fort Assiniboine, just 5 miles outside of Anaconda. Now this is part of the Montana State University's extension service now, and they've got some of the beautiful old buildings there, but the signages they have there, and the signs to get off the highway to come and see it, nobody's done a very good job of telling the story like they should. Now, what difference does it make? Well, here was the headquarters of the post commander at one time or another, and here's some of those that were trained right there. This was the parade field at Fort Assiniboine, and here's a guy, you might recognize this name over here, a guy named Blackjack Pershing. Well, Blackjack Pershing graduated from West Point. His first military assignment was Fort Assiniboine, Montana. Why did he get the name Blackjack? It was an all-black unit. Because at the end of the Civil War, and for a number of years thereafter, black troops could never be in the South. They just were not welcome at all at any Southern military post. So they were out on the western frontier. So Blackjack Pershing. We haven't done a very good job of telling the story. Yucky schmucky. Now, here's cattle country. Each dot representing 1,000 cows. Just imagine branding a maverick out there, 2, 3, 4 years old, what that would have been like. And everybody with a cattle brand. You know, the old days, it was pretty darn, you had to have quite a force there if you were going to brand and you were going to give shots and everything else, dehorn, castrate, whatever you were going to do. And what do we have now? Computer chips with everything. Evelyn Cameron, who captured so much of the early West. The little town of Terry, which has done a great job of telling the story of this young woman who came for English royalty. With her husband, they came west with the idea they were going to raise racehorses that were going to be on the European circuit. Well, she's lonely. She starts taking up photography, and she captured the American West as good as anybody could capture. Now look at the lone lady over there in the picture. She and her husband owned the place, and look at all the cowhands. Life would have been pretty darn lonely for that young woman. And here's the kind of pictures that she captured. Oh, yeah. And then, of course, Charlie Russell. And if you didn't start recording last night, number 2 is tonight, number 3 tomorrow night. The wonderful piece of it being done by PBS about Charlie Russell. Oh, by the way, every time we ever have a vote, is always voted number 1, the greatest Montana. Mike Mansfield, by the way, always voted number 2. But this one, Waiting for a Chinook. And this is, the original of this is in the Historical Society, and it's this wide and it's that high. And we have more items downstairs stored away, I'm on the board so I can tell you this, than we show, and we can't get a new facility. And I take people from all over the country on a trip every summer, and we go to Helena, and they are agog at what Montana's collection is like. And then I tell them, you're only seeing part of it. And they look at me like, what? Montanans sometimes don't get the picture. That was an editorial. The Great Plains, the Homestead era. You know, I've been working in the mills. I've been on an assembly line. I was the youngest of 6 kids. We lived in Norway or Germany. I'm not going to get one thing from the family treasures. Abraham Lincoln, 1862, signed off on the legislation. 160 acres of land. We had settled America. The Alleghenies, the Appalachians, jump to the Mississippi River, jump all the way across to the Oregon country and the California gold rush. Then we settled the Great Plains. So, this is supposed to be anybody coming west. They're going to make their fortune. This is probably the most famous of the advertising pieces. You just bring a plow out to Montana, you plow up the ground, and what comes out? Gold coins. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. But here was reality. The one-room schools, living in isolated communities, the 10 by 14 shack that you had to occupy for 3 years before it was your land, the little school that everybody went to, and everybody wants to have a county of their own because you don't want to go too far to pay your county taxes. You want to make sure that you have plenty of protection by law enforcement, people coming together, have a cup of coffee, have a meal, whatever. Between 1907 and 1917, Montana had the largest in-migration of any state in the Union per capita. Then when the winds came, it dried up. There was nothing left. We had the largest out-migration of any state in the Union in the 1920s. The Roaring 20s, we never had the Roaring 20s. Didn't exist. This is what it all looked like. Just imagine. Hard, hard land, almost always too hot, too cold, too wet, too dried up. How could it get any worse than that? So typical. 20 miles from water, 40 from wood. We're leaving dry Montana, we're leaving her for good. How many people said that? Oh yeah. Get out there and get one of those Sears Roebuck catalogs and just wish, oh, would I love to have one of those cars, man, oh man. life would have been great if I could have ever afforded. And county commissioners forever, you know what the big argument is, right here. Damn those roads. And of course we tell people now, get lost in Montana. And that's what I'm telling you all to do. Get lost in Montana. Go see this fabulous place. Go down to Reed Point and see all those sheep run down the street. What, are you kidding me? Hey, thousands show up every year. Watch a bunch of sheep run. Or the first wood-carved carousel in the United States since the 1930s was right up the road here, Missoula. Now, it's the model for many places in this country who have come in. It's amazing how many people come to Missoula, Montana. What do we do while we're here? You go see that carousel. In other words, it's a magnet. Every community has some magnets. You've got to emphasize those magnets. The Big Hole Valley, the beaver slides, for example, when I bring people out here in the summertime, this big trip that I take them on, they are absolutely captivated by the beaver slide. Something you and I guys kind of take for granted. Thinking, well, a lot of times we don't even use those like we used to, but the famous land of the 10,000 haystacks, they're captivated by these things. Fort Benton, Montana, which has done a pretty darn good job of telling its story. And the Grand Union Hotel, which has been for sale for the last couple of years. If you got an extra $1 million or so, they're ready to sell. It goes way back to the beginning of Montana's story. And one of the best animal stories you'll ever find ever, the story of Shep, the dog that waited forever and ever and ever for its master to come back. He was the last sheep herder who died. They found material that said he was from the Iowa country. Body was shipped back, and nobody told the dog. The dog waited for years for his master to come back. Met every train. And that dog died in 1941. It was the largest funeral ever held in Fort Benton up to that time. The great Bob Scriver was the one that did that piece of sculpture. Where does the dog face? Toward Iowa. Now, you go to the Ag Museum in Fort Benton. A lot of people aren't even aware of this. We have to do a better job of this. The famous Smithsonian bison, the buffalo nickel bison. Where'd it come from? Well, the head of taxidermy for the Smithsonian came out. His name was Hornaday. Came out to Montana. And in the 1880s, killed the bison. And unbelievable, the bison that when they wore out, the Smithsonian was going to throw them away. A guy named Jack Lepley from Fort Benton, Montana, convinced them to give them to Montana. And now you can go to the Ag Museum and you can see these magnificent, restored, fabulous bison. And there's our White Cliffs, this gorgeous area. I've taken people through the White Cliffs who have said things like this. I'll never forget a woman from Washington, D.C. I'm telling stories late into the evening, and you look up at those heavens and see those beautiful stars, and as quiet as could be, the embers are dying out, and this woman said, "This is the first time I have ever heard the silence." Think about that. We can hear the silence all over the place. But you're not going to hear the silence if you're from New York or Washington or Chicago or L.A. There ain't no such animal. Sorry. We've got it. Sometimes we need to do a better job of telling that kind of a story. 26 miles east of Billings, Montana, William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition was part of the Corps. Right off the interstate highway, 1.5 miles. And you can go and see William Clark's signature exactly the way he scratched it into the wall at Pompey's Pillar. That's the kind of thing that ought to be a magnet for people that live in the Warden area, the Huntley Project area. The little old museum down in Whitehall, Montana, Jefferson Valley, they've got a fabulous museum. But the biggest thing that they've got there is they had a woman who was a graphic artist from the Silicon Valley, that where her husband worked. She could be anywhere. He decided he could be anywhere. When they moved to Whitehall, Montana, she did 11 murals depicting the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now that's put Whitehall, Montana on the map, along with that little museum. And I'll tell you, these murals are fabulous. They are fabulous, taking up an entire wall of some of the buildings of the town. So here's one. It's a whole wall. There's another one. So a town, you have to find something that is kind of your pull to make a place come alive. Here's the famous Lincoln Grizz. Guy driving to work 4 o'clock in the morning, he had one of those cow catchers in the front of his pickup, driving into Missoula. Boom! Wakes him up real quick. He gets out and he had killed a bear. The 3rd and 4th graders in Lincoln, Montana were the ones that saved that bear from Lincoln. The Forest Service wanted, the University of Montana wanted that grizzly bear. Those kids convinced everybody the bear should stay in their town. The Forest Service had to end up taking out part of a wall to make a big picture window so they could show off the bear. And it pulls people into Lincoln. Well, go to Helena. Now here's one of the unsung treasures that we have. Everybody goes to the Historical Society. They go to the Capitol, up Last Chance Gulch, Millionaire Row. But here's another story. We need to do a better job at telling it. And that is the Montana Military Museum. We probably have all heard of the famous dog races, Camp Rimonai, that are held every year. Why did all this come into being? Well, it came into being for a very real reason. And that was an elite group of military guys were going to be formed. They were going to be timberjacks and cowboys and ranchers and miners from southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, and the northern tier of states. Lumberjacks, guys that have been and spent a lot of time in the woods, like to hunt, fish, cross-country ski, whatever. And they put together a unit of 2,400. They were going to attack during World War II. They were going to come down through Finland, Norway, and Sweden to divert German troops away from the center of Europe. At the last minute, the mission was scrapped. Instead, they took all these guys and they had them come up through the boot of Italy. They became known, pardon my French, the Black Bastards. They would only attack at night, and they always wore heavy camouflage. And the Germans were absolutely petrified of these guys. Now here's the story. You ever hear of the Green Berets? You ever hear of the SEALs? Special Forces? Guess where it started? Fort Harrison, Montana, in World War II. How many of you knew that story? Sometimes we don't tell our story. Big town, little town, everybody's got a story. You got to find what your story is and get it out. So, many of you have been to Washington, D.C. You've seen the Marine Memorial. Every time I go back, I'm a lifelong jogger, so I have to go run around that monument every time I ever go back there. Well, interestingly enough, it took a long time before I knew this story. One of those that was involved with the original raising of the flag of Iwo Jima was the grandson of Chief Charlot, whose family lived in the Bitterroot Valley. The grandson. That was a story most people would say, still would say, if I'd said that, they'd say, true, false test, they'd all say false. That's the truth. Okay. So, when you think of the changing face of Montana, I always think of the Prairie Cathedrals. That's all those grain elevators that are out there, and we got a ton of them. And you know how we do it today? We make those farmers come in for miles and miles around, bringing their grain into those central storage areas. And they are gigantic. But in an earlier day, it meant that people came together, and was often the reason why small towns existed even. So we see all of these places, and some of them seem to be doing great guns, and some of them aren't doing very well at all. So what are the kinds of places that do seem to be making? Well, little places like Darby's New Old Town. I kind of like what you guys have done with downtown. But when I came into town tonight, boy, there sure were a lot of lights that were out. And I know when I see a couple of those little restaurants that I always kind of like that I see that are closed down now, not telling everybody, be sure you kind of pick things up in the spring. Paint your town like nobody's business. So when people are coming up from Salmon and they're on their way up toward Missoula, for example, or they went over and they wanted to go and see the battlefield, or they wanted to go down to Sula and Ross Hole and see Charlie Russell's immortal painting, what you might want to do is make sure they absolutely have to stop in Darby. That's what you want to do.
In the liquor store.
So, let's see some of those places that have done a pretty good job. Little old Medicine Lake. Twin Bridges. They did a pretty good little job with Twin Bridges, you know, the Winston company with the fly rods. They got a great little memorial park there for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Beautiful little Catholic church, great little eating place there. Ekalaka, one of my favorites. Boy, do they have a great little dinosaur museum. And one time if you were going to take the paved road into Ekalaka, you're going to turn around and take the same road out. They didn't even have it go all the way through town. Now it does. But Ekalaka, it's a long ways away from anywhere. And it's got one of the best state parks just out of town, but they've done a pretty good job. Now here's a town that hasn't done a very good job in some ways, and that's Chinook. And when every time I drive through Hamilton, every time I go to Whitehall, every time I go to Sydney, every time I go to Hart, what do you think I take a look at? Those stacks, and I think of sugar beets. We have never done a very good job of telling the sugar beet story. Why did people come out, especially from Eastern Europe? That's where they were coming from. That was the intent. Well, as it turned out, just at the wrong time, everybody began to discover the sugar out of the Caribbean. Easier to get, much cheaper to produce and everything else. But they sat there, and where's the story though? We need to tell us our story. I've always wondered what would it look like to be a mascot for the sugar beeters, because that's what you are when you're in Chinook. And yet Chinook has that gorgeous little museum, and look at the sign. They need a lot more than that. And when you go in, it is a great one. Now, look, I went too fast there, but here's little old Ingomar. Ingomar, it's got only one thing that keeps it on the map. And that is when you go to Ingomar, you have to go to the Jersey Lily, have a drink, have the bean soup that is there all the time, and if you have to go to the bathroom, you're going to the outhouse outside. And everybody has heard of Ingomar and the Jersey Lily because it's unique. They've done something to keep themselves alive. Another little town that's done a good job is little old Troy. And we did a pretty good job of telling the stories of some of our football stadiums. Billings Gazette a couple years ago did that with all of the stadiums. And these were four of the big winners. And the nicest one that there is, bar none, nothing else even close, is Glendive, Montana.
Really?
That is a football field that a college team would be envious of having. It's as good a field as you will see if you go to the stadium in Missoula, for example. And that gorgeous track is world class. Somebody who grew up in that town, went on, played college ball, made a bundle of money, and wanted to leave something for his hometown. It's made a big difference to little old Glendive, Montana. Kremlin and Hingham, towns that meant a great deal to me because my mother's first teaching job was in Hingham. And I think of Hingham, I think of all those little towns along the High Line up there in that corner. If we start right over here at Chester, we go all the way over here to Havre. That's 60 miles. That's 60 miles. Now let me show you what is there. From Havre to Kremlin, 20. Now I'll just work my way across. 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, and 8. That's the distances. Why? Because of the early days, water, coal, timber for the trainings. Okay. So Kremlin and Guilford came together to become KG High School. Then Hingham Rudyard came together to become Big Sky High School. Joplin Inverness became JI. JI and Chester finally joined and they became CJI. Kremlin, Guilford, Hingham, and Rudyard couldn't get along about any name, so they became North Star. So we have 2 high schools in an area that at one time had 8. Now, you'll still see people who live up in that area who will still say 4 for 2. 4 for 2, meaning they want an interstate highway that goes all the way across the northern tier of Montana, because they feel that's the only way that the northern communities are going to be able to make it. So, here's a little Flaxville. I was there the very year the last student graduated from Flaxville. It's a neat little town. And a boy that graduated from there and a girl that graduated from a high school in Wyoming were invited to the Dave Letterman show. And he introduced them as the 2 students who were valedictorians of their classes in Montana and in Wyoming. And that they also graduated last in their class. Beautiful little school plant. But how many of those little empty places do we have? And there's that little Judith Gap I was telling you about. And just outside of Judith Gap, that unbelievable wind farm that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you know where we're building a big wind farm right now? Within 10 miles of Colstrip. Right now. So the world is changing. You know, sometimes we don't particularly like the change that's out there, but it's real. And there's that wind farm. And it is huge. And here's the solar energy. It's just getting bigger and bigger in all kinds of different places. Now, you know, we farm different than we ever used to, too. But it used to be that we had the Golden Triangle. And the Golden Triangle, along with Ukraine, were considered to be the 2 greatest wheat farming areas of the entire world. But you know what now? You know who else is getting into wheat? China, Mongolia. In other words, is our market going to be out there like it was? Maybe not. And of course, some of us that were around in the early days, we used to flood irrigate. Now we don't do anything like that at all now. And then you see a little place like one of those little outlier places along the Milwaukee Railroad, little old Martinsdale. There's the main street, not much there. But just a couple of miles outside of Martinsdale is something very special. But there's a great little place to eat in Martinsdale, a Country Inn, and it's a little gem. And here was the Bear family, who made so much money. At one time, the largest sheep man in the United States, 41 boxcars worth of wool carried on a train at one time from this outfit. Charlie Bear was at a national gathering one time. Everybody wanted to know how big he was. A guy from New England came up to Mr. Bear and said, Mr. Bear, I understand you're pretty big in the sheep business. Yeah, pretty big. I'm pretty big too. You're in New England. Really? How big are you? I got about 100 head. Charlie looked at him and said, are you talking about sheep or sheep dogs? But look at what you can go see. The Bear Mansion and Home Museum, which is absolutely fabulous. There's the town of Sims. Look at that. And they haven't done a very good job of telling their story, but look at the way it's designed, as though it was Washington, D.C. Look at that. But they should tell their story. So you see some of these little towns that really get out there. Here's little old Culbertson. And here's Peaburg, which has done a pretty darn good job. They really perked up the town in the last couple of years. I mean, perked it up. And you know, here's somewhere Montana, and there's anywhere Montana. And there's Plentywood. Long ways away from anybody, but they've done a pretty good job. The Montana watering holes, believe it or not, this has gone a long ways toward perking up some towns. Just like your own little pub area right here, Webo, Montana, one of my favorites because they have put this town right on the map with their Beaver Creek Brewery. And the owner right here is Big Jim. This is one of his rancher buddies. And they headlined at Red Ends Pants a couple of years ago. And these guys are really good. And people travel from North Dakota with one thing in mind, to go over and have a cold one and a bite to eat at a very good little restaurant in Webo, Montana. So these little breweries have made a big difference. They've really added a lot to a lot of communities. I was just talking about this very topic to the Chamber of Commerce down in Deer Lodge the other night. They had 85 people there for their Chamber of Commerce dinner. And they walked me across the street because I hadn't been there yet, in their new beer pub. And I'll tell you, wow, what a facility that is. It is beautiful. And now you can even buy yourself a passport to go to all the beer pubs we have in Montana. We're number 2 per capita after Vermont. And look at all the kinds that we have. You've heard of a lot of these. You know, Pig's Ass Porter and Vodka and Cold Smoke and Belgian White. And we've got a lot of great ones. And the Two Dot Bar, right over in the area of Montana where I came from, on again, off again, Two Dot Bar, sign out on the road says, easy to find, hard to leave. That's the Two Dot Bar. The Daniel County Courthouse up in Scobie. They don't do as good a job as they should. You know what this was? At one time this was a brothel. It's the courthouse, the county courthouse. And you know, you get up close to that Canadian border, and Scobie is one of my favorite towns. Because when the locals that owned the little theater there for years and years, they decided that they were going to retire. Went down and told one of the Bowler gang, one of the most famous of Montana's newspapering families, well, I guess we'll have to close her down. What? We can't close that down. And the Bowlers went down and visited with business people up and down the main street, and they took over the place. And they sold the tickets, cleaned up, made the popcorn, and now it is an enterprise where they've got the high school kids involved with the whole operation. And look at their downtown. It's as clean as a whistle. It is one of the neatest little towns. And do they have a frontier village on the edge of town and a gorgeous little 9-hole golf course. So we see some of these wonderful examples of places that have worked awfully hard, saying we're going to tell our story, we've got a great one, and we want everybody to know about it. And then there are some of the others that have just kind of given up the ship. So it's kind of up to all of us to decide what we want. Eureka, those last couple pictures are Eureka. Eureka has done a couple of amazing things. A beautiful golf course. They have an international quilting bee every summer. They have a flintlock mountain man competition every year. And they have built a frontier village in downtown Eureka. Wooden walkway along the way. A couple of great little restaurants there. A wonderful place for coffee. And they have high school kids that come down to the Canadian border and they're picked up by a bus. Everybody kind of looks the other way. They get on the bus and they go to school in Eureka, Montana, because it's far and away closer for those kids than to go anywhere else up in Alberta. They made it work. They made it work. They just said we're going to do it. So we got some places that have done well, and others I wish would do a lot better than they do. But I got a lot of favorite places. I love visiting county courthouses. I think they're often just beautiful places. Some of them have great stories to tell, and others should do a whole lot more than they do. And some people have really done a super job with their theaters. The Washoe Theater in Anaconda, and the beautiful theater in Deer Lodge, two examples of wonderful ones. Or I mean the Rialto and Deer Lodge and the Washoe and Anaconda. And in Deer Lodge, you know, the old state prison, and they've got the Grand Coors Ranch, and they tell the story of the railroading, but they don't have very good signage out on the highway to draw anybody in. And they should do what you guys have done down here. And that is from the time you started salmon and you get all the way up to Missoula, you're telling the story about each one of your communities. I commend you for that. The first time I came across that idea, I was giving a talk in St. Louis. I was asked to go over on the Illinois side to talk. And they gave a talk in this one little community. They said, oh, by the way, we have you scheduled in the next community tomorrow night, the next community the next night. And then they started telling me they call themselves the String of Pearls. Each one of them saying something positive about the next door town. And I thought that made a world of difference. So, we got a lot of great places, a lot of places that I love dearly. I could go on and on with some of these great stories. We had an alarming number of things I know nothing about, but I'll tell you this. I love small towns, and I want to see every one of them do well. And I tell people to get lost all over Montana. And for all of you living right here, you've got some real treasures to talk about. You could really emphasize even more the timber industry. And I'll tell you, when you think of the expedition meeting the Flathead Nation right down the road here at Ross Hole and Sula, and when you think of the Nez Perce and everything that happened right up over the top of the hill, those are major stories. Or Sacagawea and her own people just over the hill there in Salmon. You know, all of these are stories that ought to be told just in the same way as you work your way up then. And then automatically that you're going to go and see the Daily Mansion. And that you're going to keep on working your way up to Traveler's Rest. But every one of the places with a tale to tell. You know, you go see that beautiful mission. You drive around and get them off that road. And then one time I was with the late Louis Adams of the Salish people. And we were down here and we were both speaking down at the Ross Hole. And traveling with this man who was one of the Salish elders. As we drove back up toward the Missoula area, and I was taking him all the way up to St. Ignatius, he told me the Indian name of every mountain and had a story about every one of them. And I always wish, I wish somebody would capture that sometime to just tell that as another story. Because you've got those beautiful mountains as you work your way up. I mean, they're just treasures. So, Montana towns, and now tomorrow, I want them around. I grew up in one. And I want these towns to make it. Because I know when you go up and down Main Street and you wave at each other, and the education you get in a lot of small towns, a number of kids that have done very, very well that have come out of small town, very often the civic pride is there, or sometimes the pride it doesn't exist at all, like we just have given up the ship. So that's why I say it's then, now, tomorrow. A community has to just say we're going to suck it up and do something. And this beautiful facility you have right here, this to me is a treasure. What you have right here in this beautiful little library, my goodness. Here, I'd driven by it, never seen it before. I come into it and I look at it and go, wow, this would be a place for, seemed to me like any librarian, anybody here in the country would want to just walk in, and a whole lot of other people too, and just admire it because it's so gorgeous. Well, lots of good stories that are out there, and I appreciate getting a chance to come and visit with all of you. You know, all too often, though, I don't want them to die slowly. Why do they die? You know, it can be those kinds of things where people just kind of give up, and other places where they just absolutely refuse. And a good illustration of those kind of places that make it, that here's the little museum in my hometown of Harlowton, Central Montana Museums. So this says something about the Harlow Museum. Then it says the Bear Museum. Then it's got the castle in White Silver Springs. And you go over to the other side and it has the Milwaukee Depot. And then it takes you all the way over to Townsend. So they've kind of said, we're going to tell each other stories. Every one of them. And I always look at it this way. I tell people this all the time. Be like Calvin and Hobbes, the very last comic strip. So Calvin says, wow, it really snowed last night. Isn't it wonderful? Hobbes says, everything familiar has disappeared. The world looks brand new. Calvin says, a new year, a fresh, clean start. Hobbes says, it's like having a big white sheet of paper to draw on. Calvin says, a day full of possibilities. So, magical world, Hobbes, old buddy. Let's go exploring. And so just imagine the cartoonist, this was his last strip. Let's go exploring, like there's more. Let's go do all those other things in life. Well, isn't that exactly what we got to do with our towns too? Yeah, let's go exploring about the ways we can do to make them alive and vibrant and happy and fun. And I tell people this all the time. All the time. Go to your school play. Every one of you ought to be at the school basketball game and the football game. And everybody ought to go and do everything that is in town, because that's what makes a difference, when everybody is a participant and involved in it. It's so easy, it is so easy to carry on with this thing all the time. It just means you can stay home, turn on your TV all the time, get all your information off of this. There's way more to life than this. I was going out to speak just yesterday at beautiful Fort Missoula. And as I was riding out, it was a pretty day. The Missoula Country Club on one side, Larchmont on the other side. There were a couple of deer that ran across the road when I was driving on. And here was a guy on a bicycle, and he was all wired up here. And I thought, my Lord, there's more to life than just sitting there with those things in your ears when you ought to be looking at nature. That's mine. So, I'm driving down the road one time when we lived in Helena. Honk, honk, honk. Guy right next to me. I thought, what did I do wrong? Honk, honk. So I rolled down my window. All black car, black windows. He rolls down his window. He's dressed goth. I thought, oh my Lord, I'm done in. I'm done in. And this is what he said. I like your bumper sticker. Montana is what America used to be. And we do. We've got a lot of that wonderment. A lot of people in life. What America used to be. Well,
Thank
for having
you.
me. Thank you, Wendy.